How would you explain the purpose of this project, and which outcomes do you consider to be especially important?
It's a pan-European project which tries to bring specialists in different area studies together, to bring historians of different periods together, as well as establish a form of interdisciplinary dialogue between historians and specialists in memory studies or museology. The purpose is kind of in this new collaborative discursive environment to focus on the concept of individualized aggressor figures and to find structural similarities in the construction of narratives. A very ambitious goal would be to come up with a new theoretical and methodological lens that would treat such individual aggressor figures not as, great men of the past. Most of them were indeed men, even though we have figures like Catherine II as well, but also to treat them as projections of particular memory cultures, of particular national historiographies, of particular trends in writing about the past, as kind of these nexus points between memory studies, public history, and history of history, so to say.
I wanted to turn to your specific contribution to the project volume that is upcoming. You examined the role of the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, right? In the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, and also with your colleague Dr. Adela Grjachova. And during our interview last year, she implied that the topic was your idea. So why did you choose Brezhnev?
For me, in the beginning, it wasn't clear how Brezhnev can be treated as an individualized historical actor. Unlike Stalin, he existed in a very different constellation of Soviet politics when collective leadership was important, and 68 is also the time before kind of this neo-Stalinist turn when Brezhnev created his own cult of personality. So it was this ambiguity about the figure of Brezhnev that was especially interesting for me. Among other findings in our collaboration with Dr. Grjachova, we found that Brezhnev as an individual is indeed very present in Czech memory culture and historiography. In kind of broader historiography, it has been indeed a long-lasting consensus that the decision to invade Czechoslovakia under the banner of the Warsaw Pact, but led by the Soviet Union, was a collective decision. So Brezhnev was often presented in historiography as this reluctant mediator who had to make the ultimate decision, but trying to appease different groupings. On the other hand, there is more recent scholarship that argues that the invasion was the moment when Brezhnev consolidated his personal power. So basically, this engagement in aggression against Czechoslovakia was a personal decision, which was not necessarily motivated by the international situation, by the internal power struggles within the Soviet leadership. But this new scholarship helped us to come to the conclusion that indeed Brezhnev can be seen as an individual aggressor figure in this context.
Brezhnev's name is often associated with the so-called Brezhnev Doctrine, and this year, 2026, also began with the abduction of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro by the US troops, which US President Donald Trump quickly then declared to be part of the so-called Donroe Doctrine, named after himself, intended to restore the American dominance in the Western Hemisphere. So kind of like a parallel to the Brezhnev Doctrine. Some political commentators have already pointed out that potential American aggression against Denmark, or also another NATO ally over Greenland, would mirror this kind of Soviet aggression against the Warsaw Pact allies. What do you think about such parallels?
I would start here with the Brezhnev Doctrine itself. It was a concept which was articulated by a contemporary journalist following the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia. So basically, it didn't exist before the events, and it was used retroactively. It was later somewhat internalized by the Soviet leadership and Brezhnev himself later on. The idea that the Soviet Union cannot allow the change of regimes in the countries which it considered its own allies. However, in structural terms, the 1968 invasion didn't mean anything new. There were invasions of allies by the Soviet Union before and after. So in this regard, the Brezhnev Doctrine was not different from Lenin's doctrine or Stalin's doctrine or Khrushchev's Doctrine for that matter. It can be seen as a projection, of course, of the Monroe Doctrine. However, I would say there are some parallels between the more recent events and other moments in Soviet history, not necessarily the 1968 Czechoslovakia invasion. So if we're speaking about the situation in Venezuela, there are a lot of similarities with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, because we have a very similar scenario where Soviet forces toppled Hafizullah Amin, the president of Afghanistan, in December 1979 in a special forces operation, and installed a person who was more loyal to them. However, I would say that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was still performed on a very, at least discursively, ideological grounds. So the idea was to keep Afghanistan within kind of the state socialist path of development. However, in the case of Venezuela, we had, after the events, an explicit discussion of interest in oil. So in this regard, this is a much less discursively articulated invasion, which is more similar to 19th century examples of colonial struggle for raw materials. The situation with Greenland is, I would say, even more complex and to some extent unprecedented. Greenland is a very close ally of the US as this autonomous subject. It hosts American military bases. US military has more or less free hand in Greenland. So here again we have a return to 19th century ideas that a formal annexation is a necessary step for whatever political goals there may be. In the case of the Soviet history, I would probably draw a parallel with one annexation which is lesser known, the annexation of Tuva. Tuva was a People's Republic since 1920s. It was a very close ally of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union stationed its armed forces there, so there was basically no need for an annexation, but this annexation happened in 1944 during the Second World War when the rest of the world was busy.
As part of the Aggressor project, you are also currently publishing an edited volume with Dr. Florian Nieser, and it's about playing war digital games. Could you please explain the particular analytical perspective you're taking, which shifts to focus away from game narratives to gameplay mechanics? How do these particular source type and perspective benefit historical research in general and the study of aggressor images in particular?
I think that digital games provide a unique source for our project because international aggression, the way we define it within our project, in the sense of starting a war, is a very common mechanic, especially in strategy games. We were interested in the performative aspect of playing as the aggressor. The background of this interest comes from the overall trivialization of war. So war is made to seem everyday business, which can be seen in most digital strategy games, but also in popular history videos on YouTube. Unlike videos or films, games are actions, and players spend hundreds and thousands of hours within a single game. So this is uncomparable, a huge contrast to spending 2 or 3 hours in a movie theater. In video games, basically being and acting within the game is the most important part of the experience. Next to images and texts that are also present in the games, there is the so-called procedural rhetoric. So basically what you learn about the world through your actions within the game. Very often such mechanics, especially in digital strategy games, is based on previously existing conventions about how the past works, how wars function, how history works in general. Games also, through bringing this experience through hundreds and thousands of hours to millions of players, they reinforce specific concepts. So there is this mutual relationship of pre-existing concepts, gaming experience, and reinforcing or changing perhaps of some of the concepts. We were especially wondering, what role does the player take in strategy games? Is it a particular historical figure? Is that the individual leader or commander? And actually we came to the conclusion that the player is performing as the state in Hobbesian terms, as Leviathan. And actually in most cases in strategy games, this state is made equal to nation, which of course makes such understanding of the nation as a total kind of equivalent of a state, having one will with primordialist and even totalitarian ideas.
Let us circle back to our first question after nearly 3 years of coordinating this project and engaging with different research perspectives, as we just heard right now. How has your understanding of the aggressive figure evolved? Working on different case studies, would you say there are certain structural similarities or just parallels between them?
Within the project, we had some interesting methodological discussions. One of them related to the juxtaposition of individual and collective aggressor figures. Some of our viewers or readers can see from previous interviews there is a tendency discussed by Professor Stefan Berger about a shift to collective aggressor figures with the global expansion of nationalism. However, during the work on the Aggressor project and being exposed to all the different case studies, we noticed also the perpetual importance of individual figures. This idea that you can basically signify a particular violent event of the past or of the present with one figure. It's, I would say, concomitant with how memory works in the way of simplifying reality.